Great. Super. Thank you. I appreciate it. Now I'll let you know as we go through. So what I've really tried to do today is combine two topics. One is to look at what is the state of local news, tell you a little bit about what we now know about the state of local news that we didn't even know 2 or 3 years ago, and also talk about what you as librarians can do to both help communities understand what the state of local news is and seek out good news in a news desert. So I thought, Beth, if we could see the second slide. I would start by talking about what a news desert is. So if you're saying what is a news desert, which I did, my definition has changed somewhat over time, as have many others. So there are lots of ways to define a news desert. And look, all I want is for everybody to understand what we're talking about is a loss of local news coverage. So you can define a news desert as the loss of a newspaper, which some have. You can define it as the lack of media in any given community, as communities that are vastly underserved by a lack of access to local media, and that includes entertainment as well as news. Or you can define it the way I've come to define it. So I define it as a community, either rural or urban, where residents have limited access to the sort of credible and comprehensive news and information that feeds our democracy at the grassroots level. Now, I want to focus on one word here, and that is access. So access can be thought of in terms of not having access to content, to news content, to the news and information. It can refer to not having access to the distribution of news and information. And one of the things in this vast country that we need to be concerned about as both journalists as well as librarians is that digital divide that has emerged in many communities. One of the things that the infrastructure bill seeks to do is to kind of narrow that. I live on a farm a good portion of the year down here in North Carolina. You know, the only way I'm able to be with you today, which is, as you can see, somewhat spotty in terms of being able to connect smoothly, is because we pay the alarm company on to bounce a series of radio waves off cell towers onto the tallest pine tree, which has an antenna, an old-fashioned antenna on the top of it, on our property. Now, I can have access to that when most of my neighbors can't, because one, I happen to be fortunate enough to marry someone who was smart enough to kind of put together this Rube Goldberg contraption. But secondly, because in the midst of all of this, what has also occurred is that we have the money to pay the $200 and some odd a month that we have to pay to get our own version of high-speed internet, which anyone who's connected to a regular broadband would never call high speed. So when you think about a news desert, it would be interesting to think not just about, is there a lack of a news organization, but if there is an alternative, how can people easily access it, and can they afford to access it? So when you're thinking about access, think about it in those two terms as well. And Beth, could we have this next slide? So a lot of people have asked me, why do you focus on newspapers? And I do that in part because of a ton of research that started back in the 1970s that showed that local newspapers have been incredibly important in both nurturing democracy and nurturing community at the grassroots level. So research in the early 70s found that newspapers set the agenda for debate of public policy issues. How did they do that? They did that by the stories they decided to cover, by how they played the stories, i.e., did they put them on the front page? Did they continue to come back to the issue over and over again? And thirdly, and I think this is real important, they did it through the editorials that they then wrote after they had highlighted the issue, and that kind of showed the way we could solve the problem. And that's important because when we look at where we have lost a good number of journalists in the last few years, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, we've not only lost those reporters that used to do the major investigative and contextual and analytical pieces, more importantly, we've lost the editorial people who used to do the vetting of political candidates, who used to weigh in on what certain ballot issues were, or even weigh in on how we could solve problems that were unique to the community. The second thing newspapers have done, and that researchers have shown over and over again, is, and for this we're indebted to not just communication people, but also to political scientists as well as to economists. They encourage regional economic growth and development. Recent research has shown, for instance, that when you lose a local newspaper, the cost of doing business as a local entity goes up. You pay more because there's a perception among the people that are creating the bonds that nobody's watching over the government officials. You've lost a watchdog, so there's no accountability. So you pay more in basis points, which of course translates into the fact that you and I and taxpayers have to pay more. The other thing that happens too is that a recent study from Harvard showed that local businesses, small businesses, tend to engage in much more, shall we say, under the table kind of activities. In other words, corruption goes up. It goes up in a statistically significant fashion. And then the last thing they did is they fostered a sense of social cohesion and identity. And I want to talk about just a little bit later on some of the work that's been done at some of our great land grant universities around the country that are trying to save small communities, because what they've identified are the kind of ways that we often don't think about how the good fortune of where we live, or what are the potential for what we can do to solve the problems and ensure that our community emerges from the current decade, or even from the several decades from now, it has a good quality of life for both how we live our lives and for our future generations. Beth, could I have the next one? So when you're thinking about newspapers, what we often tend to think of the New York Times, where I worked, or the Wall Street Journal, where I worked, or maybe a big one of the metros, like the Washington Post or the LA Times. What I hope you take away from this is that we have thousands of newspapers in this country. In fact, right after the Civil War, as the country moved west, one of the first things that a founder of a local town would do is set up a newspaper, because the newspaper not only created a sense of geographic identity, it tied us back to where we were, so that by the end of the 20th century, there were roughly as many newspapers west of the Mississippi as there had been east of the Mississippi. So think about newspapers as having been integral to the formation of this country, from everything from Ben Franklin having published a newspaper on. And also think about it too, that if you think about only national newspapers, what you're actually looking at here in this capsule, it's the three national newspapers we have up here are the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. We have about 150 metro and regional newspapers. The Minneapolis Star would be in that. In North Carolina, it would be the Raleigh paper and the Charlotte paper. But they basically have circulation of above 100,000. Many of them at their peak had circulation of almost 1 million. But they tend to cover the state. But where the really nuts and bolts of how we live gets covered are in those 667 newspapers, or 500 newspapers, 6,500 newspapers that really just kind of cover what's going on in our community. They are the ones that write about everything from the weather to the local school board meeting to the county commissioner meeting. They cover all of that. They cover the arts and events that are happening in a community. So they are really the ones that kind of tell us how we can live. Now, and the other thing to consider in this very vast country is that, the newspaper is the prime, if not the sole source of news and information for most small and mid-sized communities. So let's look at what's happened to the news landscape over the last 15 years. So With the most recent report I did, we tracked the closure and merger of newspapers between the end of 2004 to the end of 2019. So in essence, it's 2005 to 2020, just before the pandemic. And what we found is during that 15-year period, the US lost a quarter of all its newspapers, 2,100. And of that, all but 70 were actually weekly newspapers. And, you know, of the dailies that we've lost, most of them had been in two-city newspapers. So that the weekly was the one that really had bound together those communities. So I want to talk about both the state and regional differently from what we lost with them and what we lost with the local newspapers. So as a result of losing those 2,100 newspapers, we now have more than 200 counties that have no local newspaper whatsoever, and 1,800 that have no other local source of news. More than half of the counties have only one newspaper, and less than only a third of them even have a daily of any sort. So when you lose the coverage of a daily, people tend to turn to television first and also to social media going forward. So if you look at, could we see the next slide, Beth? If you look at where we have lost the most papers, that has been at by region. The South has, and this is census region right now, far exceeds the loss of any other region, but there have been quite a few lost in the Midwest and the mountain area. We seem to have lost the least in the Mid-Atlantic and New England area. And I think there are several factors, including the close proximity there, so that it, you know, you typically had many small communities within a county. So we measure this by county, not by actual communities, because good heavens, there are thousands and thousands of incorporated communities, to say nothing of unincorporated communities. So we're measuring this out at the county level when we're talking about where we have lost the most. Beth, could I see the next slide? And then what is, I think, really apparent, and it gets back to access, is if we look at where we have lost the newspapers, or newspapers that have no newspaper, what we find is a great disparity in terms of the news desert counties tend to be much poorer, tend to be older, and tend to be less educated. In other words, they are just exactly the communities that actually need this free flow of and vital flow of news and information in order to solve the problems. So when you're losing a newspaper, you're actually losing a problem solver. This shows that the average poverty rate for news deserts was 18%. In fact, in many communities such as Youngstown, Ohio, that lost its daily newspaper 2 years ago, the poverty rate is often up around 30 to 40% in many of these counties. So that has huge implications, not only in terms of the polarization and the politicization of this country, but also in terms of the divide that we see often in some areas booming and others still lagging behind and suffering tremendously. So what has caused this rapid decline? And there are really a number of things, but one is basically the huge shift we've had as consumers and that advertisers have had away from traditional media like newspapers, like television and radio, over to digital. So if you see this, you can see how much digital has grown. You can see exactly how much newspaper print advertising declined during that period. And I want you to focus on the notion that, you know, prior to the emergence of Facebook and Google, between 80 and 90% of the revenues and all the profits that most newspapers made, and that includes the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, came not from subscribers like you and me. The money we paid to purchase a newspaper barely paid someone to go out and throw it on our doorstep if we had it thrown on our doorstep. In other words, 80 to 90% of the revenue and all of the profit that funded the newsrooms came from the advertisers who weren't buying the news. they were buying access to our audiences. So as consumers moved online, that advertisement followed them. And because Facebook and Google have become so dominant in many markets today, between 75 and 80% of the digital dollars in that market are going to Facebook and Google, not to your local news organizations. So stop and think for a moment what that means. That means that television, digital sites, newspapers, radio, they're all fighting over what I would call digital scraps, and that's just not enough money to sustain a good local news organization. So as a result, that's why we've lost a fourth of all newspapers. Beth, if we could move to the next one. So another thing that's been at work is that somewhere around 2008, a group of private equity and hedge funds noticed that the value of owning a newspaper dropped in the wake of the Great Recession. So in 2006 or 7, if I wanted to buy a newspaper and I had tons of cash on hand, I knew that I had to pay 13 times earnings, annual earnings in that year. So that meant that, you know, in essence, I had to hold that newspaper and nurture it for at least 14 years in order to sell it to somebody else if I was going to sell it. So I couldn't flip a newspaper, so to speak. Well, in the wake of the 2008 recession, many of the papers, the newspaper chains had bought other papers at 13 times earnings. And it's suddenly like owning a house with a mortgage that was underwater. And of course, what happened in the wake of the Great Recession, the price of owning a newspaper fell to about 3 times annual earnings. So that meant that these large hedge funds and private equity chains, which had no notion of the civic mission that had really propelled newspapers, local newspapers for 200 years in this country, could come in, buy a newspaper, be very aggressive in taking out the cost, even if that meant cutting down on reporters and the like. And then that at the end of 3 years, if the paper was profitable, they could decide, well, can I flip it and sell it to somebody else? Or can I just keep harvesting it? Or if it wasn't still profitable, you didn't pay much for it, so you just considered it a sunk cost and you shuttered it and moved on. So that's why we had so much turnover in terms of newspapers. In fact, over a 10-year period, more than half of the newspapers in this country changed hands at least once, and half of those again, so another third, actually changed hands 2 or more times. It is incredible when I look at many of the local newspapers in North Carolina, for instance, that were flipped 2 times or 3 times during a 3 or 4 year period going forward. So what we have, Beth, we could go to the next one. What we have on the as a result is that there are the top 5 owners who own have a tremendous sway over who we are. So if you look at it rather by circulation, or you look at it by the number of newspapers owned, and look how many the Gatehouse Gannett chain own. They own currently about 600 and some odd papers. It's an astounding to think that one company owns that many hundreds of papers, and to think about what that does about the disconnect between being able to go in and talk to the local publisher or editor and feel like you're going to be heard, versus that publisher or editor being part of a great corporate enterprise in which they have to go to New York or Chicago or somewhere else to even try to get an answer. So of the top 5 owners, 5 of the owners in terms of circulation are now owned by either private equity companies or hedge funds that have significant stakes in those companies. The only one by circulation that's still privately owned is Advance Publications, which also publishes, Condé Nast publishes the magazines by the same token. And then the only one that is privately owned in terms of numbers of newspapers is Adams Publishing, which is located in Minnesota. Adams Publishing Company did not even exist in 2000 until 2013. They've been very aggressive in buying up papers around, small papers in small and mid-sized markets around the country. If I'm remembering correctly, the father of the current CEO worked at the Minneapolis Star for a number of years. So there's strong Minnesota roots, and he tends to focus on papers in the Midwest as well as in the South, where most of his papers are located. So Beth, if we could see the next slide. So as a result of both corporate ownership and the result of everything shifting over to the web, what we're seeing right now is that the number of newspapers, the circulation of newspapers has dropped dramatically among both daily newspapers as well as total newspapers, weekly newspapers. And alarmingly too, along with the circulation drop, there has been a tremendous drop in the number of newsroom journalists. So in 2008, we had roughly 72,000 journalists working in newspapers around the country. Today, we have 31,000, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So when you talk about the loss of news, what you're really talking about are three things. There's the loss of actual newspapers, there's the loss of journalists, and there's the loss of circulation. So that means that if you are an outlying community, say you are 100 miles from Minneapolis and you've lost a newspaper, what you might also have lost is the coverage that the Minneapolis Star used to provide for you. So the state and regional newspapers were especially good at coming in and doing those broad trend stories that translated into major policy changes at either the state or national level. So one way to think about this is that the loss of a newspaper has hit small and mid-sized communities especially hard. The loss of journalists has hit these state and metro newspapers especially hard. So for instance, in North Carolina, the Raleigh News and Observer once had more than 300 reporters in the newsroom. Today, they only have about 40 or 50. So there's just no way you can have as aggressive reporting on things like education, where the Charlotte Observer used to have 4 education reporters, one that covered K through 12, one that covered the higher ed, one that covered policy and state legislation, and one that kind of did the contextual look of trends in education and the like. Here's one example, and Beth, if we could flip to the next one, of Kansas. One example of just what's happened to the Wichita Eagle, which is the largest circulation paper in Kansas. It once circulated in 79 counties in Kansas. Today, it is only 10. I understand since we did this, it's dropped down actually to only 6. Its circulation was well above 150,000. I think today it's somewhere around 30,000. So you can begin to see the dramatic impact that just that losing all of this has had in terms of getting good, solid information out there. Beth, if we could look at the next slide. So, there are several things to think about. One is who is currently filling the void. So one of the things we track is, okay, I think one, if you lose a newspaper, what are the chances a digital site will come in and start up? And in fact, we have quite a number. We have about 500 independent digital sites scattered throughout the country. The problem is that they face many of the same economic problems. Remember, I said that Facebook and Google kind of siphon off between 75 and 80% of the profits of the digital dollars in any market. So they're fighting just like newspapers to try to grab that digital dollar. So what increasingly they rely on, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, is people who are willing to pay for news. And of course, because we unfortunately went through a period where people came to believe that news just wants to be free, there's a reluctance of people to support and subscribe to nonprofit news. If you are looking to look especially at credible news sites, and I do think digital sites have been very good at coming in around specific topics, around specific investigative types of enterprises. If you go to the Institute for Nonprofit News, it's INN, and they keep a list of their members. They have currently about 300 members. and it will give you a list of nonprofit members. One of the nonprofit members is Wisconsin Watch, which I love. I'm very fond of. The Wisconsin Watch not only does really good investigative reporting itself, if you go there, you will see a little tab that says to you, be your own watchdog. And it is kind of like a webinar, that online webinar that teaches you how to ask for all sorts of government information and the like. So it's a nice resource for normal citizens who have lost a newspaper, are concerned about something that they might want to investigate with the county commissioner meeting. And it just kind of walks you through, how do you do a freedom of information request? What do you ask for? How do you go about doing it? And so it's just kind of all the kinds of nuts and bolts that investigative reporters would do. And of course, they also rely on citizens to give them nice story tips. So anyway, that is the Institute for Nonprofit News. And it's called INN. If you go to the website, you can look at the members and can locate members that are in your state. Another source has been, of course, ethnic media. And there's been a lot of work recently. We track ethnic media, but we focus only on ethnic news organizations. The folks at City University in New York, CUNY, have recently put together 2 reports, one on where is Latino media and where is Black media. So it encompasses not just news, but also entertainment. The argument that those researchers make is that there's news and information, for example, in beauty magazines that are important to ethnic communities that mainstream newspapers would not, mainstream news organizations wouldn't cover. So they do a much wider, broader stroke of where the research is to do that. So again, those are, you can just, you can Google state of Latino media, state of Black media, and you can see what CUNY has done, and they're in the process, I think, of just publishing a major report on Black media. So it is an exhaustive one, just like the one we've done, but it gives you a fuller look at where ethnic media is and what the future might be as we become an increasingly majority minority community going forward. Could I see the next slide, Beth? And then the next slide, of course, is looks at public media and public broadcasting. And in that, I think that where we can look most significantly is what NPR has done. NPR has added a couple of thousand reporters over the last 5 years in an effort to kind of shore up and move into areas that have lost news organizations. And the good thing about radio, too, is that it's basically accessible. You don't have to rely on broadband. It's basically accessible in about 98% of this country. And in fact, it's accessible on most reservations in the country too, from all of that. So that is a kind of good way to kind of give you an umbrella view of some of the major issues in the state. And you can find public broadcasting groups that are partnering with regular news organizations, or as is the case in California, are partnering among themselves to try to make sure that the big issues that were once covered in major ways by either the state and regional newspapers or by local or regional news organizations are being covered. The only thing I would caution there, and I use North Carolina as an example, we have 17 broadcasting, theoretically 17 public broadcasting outlets in North Carolina. Only 2 of them actually produce local content. So it's one of those things where you need to know what are the ones that are actually creating the content and what it's not. But those are really good sources for information about the state that is being done at kind of a 5,000-foot level instead of down at the 1,000-foot level. And then finally, there are a number of new media barons who, for whatever reason, have stepped forward and decided they're going to buy and save the local paper. So one of those is the Boston Globe, is owned by also the owner of the Boston Red Sox. And of course, the Star and Tribune was also bought by the owner of one of the major sports franchises. And both of them on their own have kind of set off in a different direction, have tried to prove that they are really devoted to the state and to the community where they're located, and that people will pay to get the kind of news that they get from the Star Tribune and the Boston Globe, regardless. And then, of course, there are numerous philanthropic efforts that are ongoing right now. Knight kicked it off, the Knight Foundation, by urging philanthropists to look at news as a cultural of cultural importance and of societal importance, in the same way large philanthropies have typically looked at things such as the arts as something that's worthy of a donation. So this is a kind of a slow slog, but you do see that more and more philanthropies, whether it's the MacArthur Foundation or the Ford Foundation, are beginning to try to see how they can invest in nurturing good local journalism, realizing that it's essential for this democracy and the society to have good, strong local journalism going forward. The Linfest Institute is like a number of growing organizations in many of the metro markets, like Salt Lake, and also like the Poynter Institute down in Tampa. It has been for any number of years, in which they basically set up the newspaper as a nonprofit beneficiary of whatever money that they can bring in. So the Institute funds the newspaper, and also allows the newspaper to begin to continue to, in some way, attract advertising and like going forward. So, I would say that the main problem we have, though, is if you look at all of these, you tend to see that if you lose a newspaper, the place that you're most likely to have coverage by an ethnic media organization, by a new digital site, or by a public broadcasting, unfortunately, is in the metro areas that already have several media options and tend to be more affluent. So we have a huge disparity, for instance, in our digital sites, in that 90% of them are located in what we would call very blue portions of the country. And in part, they're located in philanthropic, or they locate whether for-profit or nonprofit in those large metro areas, because there's just more access to capital. There has been a great study out of the University of Indiana that showed that not only is for-profit capital largely located in metro areas, there is a huge disproportionate effect and a disproportionate amount that's available to communities that are outside, in terms of philanthropic dollars, that are outside of major metro areas. For instance, if you look at the amount of the endowment of the Cleveland Community Foundation versus that in Youngstown, it is of the magnitude of many hundreds of billions of dollars. And that in turn affects what they can actually give to the community or go forward on. So Beth, if you could switch to the next. So what we've really had here is the coronavirus impact has, of the last year and a half, has really exposed the disparities in news coverage of communities and pointed out the perilous economics of local news, but it's also increased reader appetite for local news and bipartisan support for policy changes to support local news. We are at the moment perhaps on a significant bill before Congress called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act that if all goes according to what its sponsors want, will be part of the reconciliation Build Back Better process that would, for the first time in this nation's history, provide significant indirect tax benefits to news organizations that actually go out and hire reporters. So it aims to give it indirectly. There are no strings attached in terms of the government dictating a grant or the terms of the grant. In order to, it applies to newspapers, it applies to digital sites, it applies to television broadcast outlets. What you would need to qualify for the tax credit, when you get a credit for up to half of the salary, is that you would need to go hire new reporters. The flip side of that too is that it is very much a transitional bill. It allows you to it makes it so that we're going to assess it in 3 to 5 years and see how it's worked. Has it created more news stories and the like? So, I mean, it'd be interesting to see whether that passes. It was it was taken out of the House bill a week and a half ago, and everybody said, okay, well, it won't happen this time. It got put back in within 2 days. So we will see what makes in the final hash that comes out of the Build Back Better process in the next 2 weeks as to whether it continues to be part of that. It is significant because the U.S. is dead last by a long shot among developed democracies in the support that it gives public media. We are nowhere near the kind of support that comes in from other developed democracies, whether you're talking about Great Britain, whether you're talking about Germany, France, or Japan. We come in with just mere cents, where they're giving quite several dollars a year, often tens of dollars a year per tax dollar to support public media going forward. So Beth, could we see the next? So there are really 4 challenges for newspapers and news organizations, local news organizations to survive and thrive. We need to change the journalistic mission. So we're covering communities that have traditionally been underserved. And the most obvious example comes up to many of the minority communities that have been at best ignored by mainstream media. That involves not only creating more diverse hiring, but also just being more mindful of the fact we're becoming a very different country in the 21st century. We need new business models. We need for-profit models, which are going to continue to work in some markets, like perhaps the Minneapolis Star Tribune. We need nonprofit models like the Linfest Institute and the Philadelphia paper. And we also probably going to need some public support, at least for those economically struggling communities, at least during the transition period, which is why we need new policies that are updated. Our policies right now were basically created back in the 1930s. And of course, we're a very different country today. And we're going to have to address look at technology too, not just for what the benefits can be, but also some of the issues that may have risen with misinformation, disinformation, and the whole like during the last several years. There are currently at least 6 that I'm aware of lawsuits that have been filed that aim to get Facebook, Google, and potentially Amazon and Apple to share more of their revenues that they have acquired with news, since they have, whether intentionally or unintentionally, actually contributed to the demise of local news in a significant way. Beth, if I could have the next thing. One of the things that we can be thankful for is the FCC was very concerned about this in 2011, brought a group of people together from various disciplines, political science, history, sociology, economics, and said, come up with a list of what any ordinary resident, don't even have to be a citizen, needs in terms of news and information. You just live, go out and live their day, to know where to buy things, to know whether it's safe to go somewhere. So they came up with 8 topics that included public safety, health, education. Transportation was, I think, broadly defined as infrastructure. So that included digital access, environment and planning. So that included development as well as environmental threats, economic development, civic information on everything from where you could go to see a nice school play or a football game to more high-minded things such as the county government, and then of course political life. I think what's interesting, Beth, if you could flip to the next one, is thinking about how that overlaps with the kind of information that the University of Kansas State University did a massive look at communities that were dying, and what they identified is we tend to think of dying communities as being economically deprived. And in fact, what they did is they went into many of those communities and got people to think about, what kind of capital do you have that's not financial? What is your social capital? What is your cultural capital? What natural resources have you got here? What kind of infrastructure capital have you got? So a healthy community, as they came to see it, was 7 capitals across strong communities. Finally, I would say to you, there's if you go to the page where that I'm going to show you in just a minute, usnewsdeserts.com, it has 350 interactive maps that allow you to drill down to the county level in every state in this union. We've also put on there, done a kind of rate your own local news. And it basically shows you, it's a simplified form of what news researchers that employ hundreds of graduate assistants do when we look at a newspaper and say, is it providing the critical information that a community needs? And so it just kind of walks you through in very simple steps. I've used this with in classrooms. I've seen librarians use this to get elementary students to even track over a week's period. How well did a local newspaper, how well did the local TV station cover the news that was important in the local community? So I would encourage you to go there. You can download the form. You can see it in the right on the upper right-hand page of this, where it is located on the page. Beth, if you could go to the next slide. And this is the page. There's a home page, and then there's one for each of the states. So if you go into the home page, you can see a range of information. You can download the entire 2020 report that talks about not only what's happened over the last 15 years and why, but also looks ahead over the next 15 years to say what the opportunities as well as challenges will be. If you look down roughly about halfway down the page, you can go in on and look at not only past issues. I've done 4 reports now on the state of local news. The current one's on the right, the left side, and as I'm looking at it, and the others on the right side, the other previous reports on the right side as I'm looking at it. In between is something that I think you'll find interesting. There's a spotlight on research, and it has links to some of the really good research that's been done by scholars around the globe. And then there's an interesting one that just kind of gives you right next to it a spotlight on entrepreneurship. This some of the kind of interesting material that and spotlight on entrepreneurs that are part of the book that I wrote in 2018 called The Strategic Digital Entrepreneur. Finally, I wanted to share with you a couple of interesting library projects that I've been involved with, and perhaps it might spark an idea for you. This picture is for an edit-a-thon. We called it a Wikathon for local news organizations that we held at UNC 2 years ago, right before the pandemic struck. And the idea came, I think, out of Washington State and perhaps the University of Washington librarian there. And what we did is we noticed that there were very few entries for local newspapers. And quite frankly, North Carolina's been quite lucky in that it has had quite a robust history of local, strong local journalism. 4 of the 7 Pulitzer Public Service Awards won by North Carolina newspapers in the last 50 years have gone to newspapers with circulation under $10,000. 3 of them were weeklies. So real, and they've done things like take on the Ku Klux Klan, as well as take on environmental destruction and damage. So what we did is we got a group of students together. In the end, I think we had about 50 students who came in and spent and edited about 137 or 150 entries in terms of adding new newspapers in. The other thing that has been done in conjunction with the League of Women Voters and the library system in Washington State is they have begun to track their own local news sources. And what they've come up with, interestingly enough, points to what I think is going to be an emerging problem that we need to watch. And that is the emergence of these fake news sites that are funded by PAC money, in which they come in and adopt a name like Clark County Today, or let's say Minneapolis News. It makes them look like a legitimate news site. And they're really very hyper-partisan news sites that tend to go dormant until there's an issue that flares up. They run not so much on the notion that people are going to the website, but that certain people will go to that website, pick up that link, and then circulate it on social media. So the nice part about having the League of Women Voters track that in conjunction with us and with the Attorney General there, as well as with the library system, is that we're beginning to spot some of these and can, using the standards that I just meant of rate your local news, we can isolate them and spot them quite quickly and keep them out of the information. And for, at least make librarians aware that this is not a legitimate site, and they in turn can make others aware that it's not. Finally, Beth, I just wanted to end with this, which is that whole notion that you know, journalism at its best informs the public, and that's why it's so essential that we think about how we save local news and do what we can to identify good, solid sources of local news during this time of transition. Librarians become the essential bulwark in making sure that those who may not be aware of what all is going on in the detail that I've just shared with you are actually seeking out valid and credible sources of news and local information and spotting where the holes are so that we can begin to address those going forward. I'm going to try to switch back now and I can, to Zoom. Nope, I can't. Let's see. Let's see.
Are you trying to look at the questions?
I can't even get into Zoom. I can't, nothing on the picture is coming up. That is my problem.
Okay. So, well, there aren't really any questions that I can see, but does anyone have any questions for Penny or any comments? I know someone did say earlier, this is very depressing. I hope we will talk about what we can do. Subscribe to your local newspaper for one thing, right?
Well, let me just say there are a number of things you can do. One, if you've got a good local newspaper, by all means, subscribe to it. Look to see there's something called Newsmatch that occurs once a year, in which everything that you give to a nonprofit news organization will be matched. And so that's newsworthy. If you don't have a good local news organization and there's a good, strong nonprofit statewide digital site, by all means, go to that. The other thing you can do is all the talks that I've seen there before on civic literacy and media literacy. Those are really important, and that's a role as a librarian you can do, and you can help people find legitimate news sites. And of course, that's the other thing, is helping people understand what really is at stake. One of the more depressing things I think came out of the Pew survey, Pew Research Center, back in 2018, when they said, when they asked people, you know, are you aware of, you know, how good is the local news that you're getting? And they said, well, we've noticed there's a lot less. And then they asked people, are you aware that news organizations are in financial straits? And almost 3/4 of people were not aware at all of what I've just shared with you. So making people aware that, you know, we've relied on a business model that for 200 years worked pretty well, and we're in a situation right now where we need to think of new business models. Now, here's the good news. I've spent 14 years now working with news organizations of all sizes, and there are for-profit models that are working. I can cite quite a few. There are some really interesting, innovative experiments that are going on at newspapers as they try to transform themselves. And then there are nonprofit ones that are working. Where I'm most concerned right now, and that's where I think you as librarians can really be focused on, is on those economically struggling, traditionally underserved communities that really need this vital information. And how do we get it to them? Is it, and I think it's going to have to be a combination of things like the importance of broadband, the importance of expansion of broadband, as well as supporting those non-for-profit sites, as well as others that are going to bring the information there to people. So while this may be depressing, I guess I'm the eternal optimist. I've seen quite a few news organizations transform themselves, both small ones as well as large ones. And I am, there are certain communities I feel really good about that are going to have great coverage going forward. There are others that I just, where I worry the most are where we have traditionally underserved those economically struggling communities, because I think that is contributing immensely to the polarization in the politics here that we have, of people just thinking they're ignored even by their local news organizations. One other hopeful sign from all of this, Pew and Gallup have also tracked trust in media and trust in local news organizations that still exist is much, much higher than trust in national news organizations. It also tends to divide among parties. Something like 90% of Democrats have trust in their local news organizations, whereas I think it's less than only about 50% of Republicans do. But still, overall, something like 75% of people in this country say they trust local news organizations, where less than 50 say they trust national news organizations. So the more that we can make politics local, the more we can make journalism local, the more we can make the issues that we can really solve and tackle local, I think the better it is. And that's why journalism feeds into that, as well as the library system, quite frankly.
All right, we've got a couple comments. I know we're at time, so I'm just gonna read this last one. It's disturbing when a local newspaper hires within its staff very conservative editors. It skews the political climate. What can be done without alienating the editors?
Good news organizations are going to try to keep the editorializing and the viewpoints to the editorial page and out of the local news sites. I've seen quite a few news organizations that have been bought by conservative people, and I think that some of them that are big donors to conservative causes. The worst thing that can happen is if they start bringing the national stories in and making it about a local issue, and that's what we see with the hyperpartisan sites. I would hope that that is a tough one. I mean, I don't know how it. What you would do that would alienate, unless you just absolutely go talk to the person about the fact that you as a librarian find that the stuff is not appropriate for the front page or should be on an editorial page. But I mean, I think that the most you can do as a librarian is the most is educate people as to how to look at that. And again, use that monitor of rate your local news to see whether it's useful information that's coming in.
All right, thank you so much, Penny. We are a little over time. Folks, if you will please take a moment to fill out the evaluation you will get once you log out of Zoom, we would really appreciate it. And then I just want to thank Penny again. This was incredibly interesting and very informative. So thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And everyone, have a great afternoon. Don't hesitate to contact Linda Mork or myself with any questions about the Media Landscapes campaign. Thank you all, and Penny, I will be in touch.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks much.